Hey, welcome to another episode of Clear Light Connections, where we talk to the people behind the businesses of Bay Area Houston, proudly sponsored by UTMB Health. Special guest today, Dr. Jeff Temple, and you are the wearer of many hats at UTMB. Please tell us what you do there and what your main jobs are.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And recently, I became the Vice Dean for Research and Scholarship at UTMB's School of Nursing. I'm also a professor and licensed psychologist, and finally, I'm the founding director of our Center for Violence Prevention.
That last one, you helped found that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's something that I have wanted to do since I joined UTMB in 2007, and really had my eyes toward developing a center to really focus on preventing violence. And what that means is, from a research perspective, so studying stuff that, interventions, prevention programs, causes, contributors, consequences, predictors, all that sort of stuff, while also being a resource for community. So if someone wants to do something on workplace violence, that they can call us in, or a school wants something on dating violence or bullying, they can call us in. And then also education, so that we train the next generation of researchers and educators on how to prevent violence, how to recognize violence.
Yeah, and I guess that's a big thing for UTMB, since it is an education-based institution.
It really is, and I think that's one of the reasons they were so supportive of developing this center, is that we get to train and teach medical students and nursing students and public health experts all on the importance of violence, and it really is, unfortunately, an important topic. We talk about things like infectious diseases and COVID, for example, which shut down the world. Well, if you really look at the problem of violence, it kills scores more people than COVID ever did, and that's saying something.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that UTMB is taking a stand and at the forefront of violence prevention, because it is that important.
Well, and I feel like UTMB's made this commitment to looking at medicine more holistically, including, like you said, violence and psychology and things like that. They really seem to be taking a more holistic approach.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, I'll say this. I do not think that was the case for any institutions, not just UTMB, as early as a couple decades ago. I think it is more recently that we started to recognize academic medical students more globally, the interaction between the mind and the body, that you can't focus on one without focusing on the other. It's really silly to try to treat, say, for instance, diabetes, but then don't do anything about goal-directed behavior or how to change, or mental health. It just doesn't work.
Now, so it seems to me that probably in the last 10 years, mental health has come to the forefront, and it's finally getting not only the recognition and attention it deserves, but it's becoming more acceptable to talk about it.
Absolutely. The stigma has definitely decreased. I mean, just in my 2 decades of being a psychologist, where no one would talk about it, to now where with teens, for instance, or young adults, it's almost an anathema to not have a therapist or a counselor. I mean, this seems to be more of the norm than it used to be, where it was, oh, you're seeing someone, you have to see someone. And we're even seeing it with men, I think, while still lagging behind women in many respects.
As I'm constantly reminded.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I even think that is in the case where men are becoming, less stigmatized in terms of seeing mental health providers. And then people of color who have traditionally, especially like Black men, it was just not talked about at all. Mm-hmm. And then more recently it has. I actually think that the COVID was the silver lining of it was recognizing how important mental health is. What we saw after a year of losing our social connections and sort of our routines is how we were just on the precipice of falling apart as globally and as individuals. And I think that this really shined the light on the importance of emotional health and mental health. And we're starting to see that result in policy change and funding, and we're finally getting the help we need from states and feds, and just the attention that it should be getting.
Yeah, and it's about time. I mean, we've done everything but talk about mental health and the role it plays, and homelessness, all these things that are bad in our society, I think most of them come down to mental health.
There's not one medical problem, social problem, behavioral problem that does not interact somehow with mental health or substance use. Everything. If we're talking about cancer, well, that's going to affect your mental health. If and you know, so we need to attend to it. If we're talking about, like you said, homelessness, there's probably not an unhoused person out there that doesn't have a mental health problem that's either caused from being unhoused or contributed to the fact that they are unhoused. Substance use that goes hand in hand, violence. I mean, every single thing that we can think of and talk about, mental health makes it worse, contributes to it, or as a result from it.
So you mentioned the Center for Violence Prevention. Is it just me, or it appears as though we've become more violent as a society? I think the last few years, it just seems like it's out of control. Are you noticing that? Is that one of the things that you're noticing in through your work in the center?
You know, it does seem like that. Absolutely. Now, when you start to look at the data and some of the violent crime data, a lot of it it's a little bit more nuanced, but a lot of it has gone down in the past, 2 to 3 decades. But then we see other things like firearm violence has increased, and then we see other things like partner violence has become less of a private matter, and people are more likely to talk about it and report it and screen for it. So a lot of it is more just we're attending to it now, and because of that, I think it appears more so. But I would agree that it does seem like it, and I think that it's more nuanced. Some factors are increasing, some are decreasing. So, but all in all, the violent crime does actually seem to be coming down.
So, coming out of COVID, I feel like we went back to work kind of early. We were considered an vital, whatever they called it, business. I felt like we were only out for a couple of months and straight back into the office. And it was like so welcoming. I can't imagine these people that have been out 2.5 years. Talk about not only the impact on their mental health, but I noticed the students. It doesn't matter when they were a student during that process. Like some lost their senior year, others were transitioning from 6th grade to high school. Talk about some of the things you've seen that have been kind of noticeable patterns on mental health coming out of COVID.
I'll jump ahead a second, and I promise to come back here. But one of the things that I always say is the final wave of COVID, whatever it is going to be mental health, and it's going. We've asked kids, adults, everyone to go through a whole lot the past few years. Kids, my kids were both in high school. One finished out her, taken out of her junior year, finished her senior year, and what everyone else experienced in COVID, and it was tough. It was hard, and I think there's going to be a mental health impact on this generation for years to come. I do think most will catch up. We're resilient as humans, as people. But some of the less fortunate will not, and oftentimes it's what we see more reflective of society. It's marginalized groups. It's harder to catch up with those kids, and I think we're going to see that, and for again, another decade or so to come. And I'll say another silver lining of COVID is that we realized how much our social interactions matter. Like you mentioned, coming back to the office, we had a similar thing with my group. It was 2 to 3 months, and I had to get back. I think the silver lining for me was realize that I'm not the misanthrope that I thought I was, that I actually do like people.
Yeah.
And I need to be around people. And I also kind of like work.
Yeah.
And I need to work. I saw there's this one meme that all of the listeners have probably seen. It's been around for a long time, but it's basically a deserted house in the middle of like this beautiful island, and it says, "Could you live here for 1 year without your cell phone, without anyone else, just on this beautiful island with a nice house and all the amenities for $10 million?" And I think prior to COVID, my answer was an immediate yes, of course. That's a stupid question, but man, after like 6 months in COVID, I was like, I think I'd give up to $10 million. I need people.
Yeah. No, I'm not the introvert I thought I was.
Exactly. So related to that, my team and I just got a grant to look at the long-term effects of COVID, especially COVID-induced stress and isolation, and the economic perils associated with it, and we're wanting to look at the long-term effects of this school disruptions and this social isolation. So we actually had a study that was looking at seventh graders in Houston, Fort Bend area who had got a healthy relationship program. By the way, many of the schools here in Clear Lake are receiving this healthy relationship program. And we're following them to see if that relationship program worked. But it just so happened that we did this in 2018, a couple of years before the pandemic. So we serendipitously had all this pre-pandemic mental health, psychological, substance use, all these really cool data, these really neat variables that now we can look and see if COVID itself had an impact on these variables. So we got a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to follow these kids who are hardly kids now. Most of them are about 18, and so we'll follow them till a few years post high school. So we'll know from 7th grade to 3 years post high school how they're doing and how COVID affected them.
So it'll be the same kids.
Same kids, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I wonder if you could do something with 7th graders now and kind of tie that in, maybe.
It's actually a really smart idea that we should write another grant, honestly, to look at that sort of the cohort differences between 7th grade to a couple of years post high school, post COVID versus this sample who had to live through COVID, which does worry me though. I mean, if you look at our area, we've had to be very resilient, and thankfully we are here in this Houston, Clear Lake, Galveston area. But we've been asked to be resilient about a lot, not only the pandemic, but freeze and hurricanes and flooding. And I mean, even sort of like the Travis Scott thing that happened. I mean, there just seems to be tragedy after tragedy. Exactly.
So we've got the holidays coming up, and for some people, best time of the year. For a lot of other people, not so much. We call it what? The blue holidays.
Yeah, winter blues, seasonal blues, holiday blues. Yeah.
Talk to me about what causes it around this time, and what we should be looking for in our loved ones, really, because people can hide that pretty good sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that makes it especially difficult in terms of what you said about hiding it, is that it's supposed to be this wonderful time of the year, right? And so that has the impact that now not only are we sad or we have the blues, but now we're expected to be happy and everything's wonderful. So I think it's much more difficult to be sad. You're not allowed to be sad, sort of, in this time of year. So going back to there's a couple different, there's winter blues, which is going to be just more like a funk, like you're just not feeling it. You're more stressed than usual, maybe sleep a little longer than usual, maybe down, but it's really not affecting your day-to-day life. So there's that, and that's something we definitely need to attend to and be mindful of. And we see that with people who maybe have lost a loved one during this time period. It's difficult, especially a recent loss, maybe a first Christmas without that person. Then we have things that are more seasonal, like what your listeners may be aware of is SAD, seasonal affective disorder. And that is where folks start to, their melatonin is not regulated enough because of the shorter days. And by the way, I think we need a podcast on the foolishness of daylight savings times. We just need to.
I don't disagree.
We need to get rid of it. Anyway, that's for another time. But it's the shorter daytime hours, less exposure to light in the outdoors, and we see a real seasonal pattern with depression where it's almost like some people hibernate, so to speak, where they need to sleep more, social withdrawal, crave more carbohydrates. Put on more weight, and then it really starts to affect their day-to-day life. So that's more than winter blues. This is, actually getting in the way of being a productive husband or wife or parent or, out in the workforce or just having fun.
Yeah. So what do we do for those family members if we're noticing those things? I mean, you can't force somebody to,
Maybe. So actually, I'm glad you said that. Certainly you can't force anyone. But one of my favorite treatments for depression is what we call behavioral activation. And sometimes that is what it means is forcing yourself to do something that you used to be interested in. Because oftentimes what depression does is it has this really insidious pattern where you're depressed, so you don't do stuff that you like to do. And because you don't do stuff you like to do, you're not reinforced. You're not, there's nothing to combat the depression. So if we can kind of trick the body and the mind and say, force you to do that thing you used to like to do, even if you don't want to do it, even if you have zero interest in it, if we could trick you into do that, and then you start to remember, I do kind of like doing this. I do want to do this and look forward to it. Well, you can't be having a good time and depressed at the same time. It's not possible. So we do kind of force that on folks. But back to your question on what do we do for those families? I think first and foremost is being supportive and being someone there that they can talk to. So it's not just when they're, seasonally depressed or when something bad happens. It's just being that person and that relationship partner, whatever the relationship is, that they can open up to you and be someone to talk to. And then as an outside observer, being mindful of the things of what depression looks like or what being in a funk looks like. And that might be, again, not doing stuff you used to enjoy. It might mean sleeping longer. It might mean crying a lot. It might be talking negatively about yourself. Now, that all being said, I also want to tell the listeners that it's okay to not be okay sometimes. It's okay to be in a funk. That's sometimes part of life as well. Now, when I start to worry about it is when it gets and impacts your day-to-day life and your relationships and all that. But it is okay to not be okay, and it's hard right now. There's a lot of us that are going to be sad, and that's okay. We just want to also get you better.
Yeah, and the holidays kind of remind me of social media. So the holidays, everything's supposed to be good, joyous. Social media, everybody's putting their best foot forward, and nobody goes on there and posts about the bad stuff. So these people get this false sense of, oh, these people are living a better life than I am. And how has social media kind of changed the way how it's affected our mental health?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I've never heard it compared to that, but it is similar, right? Like when you actually look at holiday dinners and holidays, they're, before the fact and after the fact, they're great. I love it. I love family. But if you actually interviewed people during the family dinner or the event, it's typically a lot of bad times, and which is okay, but it's a lot. It's stressful. And so I think that comparison to social media is apt. To social media itself, the research is a bit mixed on how it's affected our mental health and our social health. I think in a lot of areas, and for a lot of people, it has actually improved it. Things like it was very protective for kids during COVID because, imagine if it was 19, I'll date myself. When I was in high school in 1996 and that exact same thing happened, I wouldn't have been able to talk to my friends except for landlines. And then I would have been competing with that landline with my brother and two sisters. And so this way they got to FaceTime and they got to pretty much hang out with their friends as usual, as normal. So it was a bit protective for things like COVID and schooling, even as disastrous as it was sometimes, they were able to continue schooling in some regard. But in terms of the, like the comparison and looking like everyone is having a good time all the time and you're not, that is deflating. I mean, it's defeating where you look at someone and they're, you see one friend is in, the Caribbean this week and another friend's in Europe the next week. It might be their only trip that year, but now you're thinking everyone's always gone doing something cool. And here I am just, my worthless self doing this. And so, it can feed the depression, especially if you're already depressed. I think that's where it's important is if you're already negative and you're already feeling lousy, that's going to be stuff that just confirms that.
Yeah. And so kind of a sense of how mental health, you dated yourself, I'll date myself. I was in high school in 89. No such thing as mental health. Nobody knew what that meant. the 2000s, it got a little better. But I think right now, I on the radio, I heard it was a poll or some research being done. And I think it was like young to mid-aged people. And it was like, I think the gist of it was that would you date somebody if they had a therapist? And overwhelmingly, it was yes. It was seen as a positive. It was seen as self-improvement. And I think that's remarkable to think 10 years back, 20 years back, how far this issue's come.
1,000,000%. Yeah, absolutely. And I did realize that I incorrectly dated myself in favor of me. It was actually in high school in 94 I graduated, not 96. I was in college. So I'm older than even I thought.
You had a good time. You can't remember.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I remember I went to a psychologist when I was in grad school, and I didn't tell anyone. I kept it completely quiet because I thought and that was, only 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And now I wouldn't care. I'd tell everyone and anyone who wanted to listen.
Yeah.
And what I tell my patients or people who are thinking about psychologists or therapists is, that I really think that we should have a therapist just as we have a general practitioner. I mean, let's protect ourselves. And in fact, I think if we had a therapist, we'd be much less likely to need a general practitioner. So, prevention is key, and mental health is prevention.
Yeah. And so are you still practicing?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you still see patients?
I still do see patients,
Okay.
yeah.
That must be the rewarding part of the job.
You know what it is? A lot of people would talk about how do you not bring this home with you, and it must be terribly sad, and sometimes it is. I mean, we talk to people that have had experienced really bad stuff and going through tough times. But I think the flip side of that is that you get to see people improve and do better, and that's something that I choose to take home with me. And
yeah.
some of my favorite clients to treat, I prior to taking this job with nursing, I was in the OB-GYN department where women who had postpartum depression, and it's very similar to what we were talking about with the holidays, is that you're supposed to be happy, it's supposed to be a great time, you have the baby. Everyone's really focused on you and the baby, and then after a week, everyone leaves and you're alone.
And it's hard work.
And it's tough,
Yeah.
and you're not going back to work likely. You're staying home a little longer. Everyone's kind of, understandably, kind of deserted you, and you're stuck with this baby 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you feel guilty if you want to spend 1 second away from this baby. And so then that combined, everything's terrible. And so my first assignment is, first I tell every postpartum woman, this is perfectly normal. I don't think you're going to hurt the baby. You're not going to. You're just sad, and it's a terrible time for you right now. And you feel guilty because you're sad and it's a terrible time for you right now. So next time I see you, you're going to be better, and this is the way you're going to do it. I'm forcing you to go on a date. I'm forcing you to do something by yourself without the baby. I don't care how it happens. If you have zero money, you'll trade cleaning for babysitting, whatever it takes, but you're going to spend some time by yourself and away from the baby.
Yeah, my wife and I realized real quick it's not all fun and games having babies.
No. In fact, what I always say, I totally agree with you. What I always say, and I say this to my kids as well, is when they were growing up, my two favorite times of the day was seeing them and leaving them. I mean, I couldn't wait to go to work some days.
I'll bet. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.